the child who pretended not to be Jewish. I was only 9 years old when I learned that a single word could get me killed. Before the war, my world was small and ordinary. I lived with my parents and my younger sister in a quiet neighborhood. My father owned a small shop. My mother baked bread every Friday. And my biggest concern was whether I would finish my schoolwork before going outside to play. We were Jewish, but to me that was simply part of who we were. It was not something I thought about every day. It was not something I feared. Then everything changed. The soldiers arrived slowly at first. New rules appeared. Signs went up. People who had once greeted us warmly began looking away. Some crossed the street when they saw us coming. Others whispered behind our backs. My father tried to shield us from the truth. He would smile and tell us that difficult times eventually passed. But I could see the worry in his eyes growing deeper every week. Soon we were forced to leave our home and move into a crowded ghetto. Families were packed into tiny apartments. Food became scarce. Disease spread quickly. Every day brought new rumors. Someone had disappeared. Another family had been taken away. Nobody knew exactly where they were going, but everyone understood one thing. They were not coming back. One evening after curfew, my father called me into a small room. He closed the door behind him and sat beside me. His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking. He told me that I needed to memorize a new name, a Christian name. He made me repeat it again and again until I could say it without hesitation. Then he taught me a new birthday, a new address, and the names of people I had never met. I did not understand why any of this mattered. Finally, he looked directly into my eyes and said something I would never forget. If anyone asks, you are not Jewish. The words felt strange, impossible. How could I pretend to be someone else? How could I deny who I was? My father squeezed my shoulder. You must remember, your life may depend on it. A few weeks later, the deportations intensified. Trucks arrived almost every day. Families vanished overnight. One morning before sunrise, my mother woke me up. Her face was pale. She handed me a small bundle of clothes and told me to stay silent. Outside, the streets were dark. We moved quickly through narrow alleys until we reached a house on the edge of the city. A woman opened the door. I had never seen her before. My mother knelt in front of me and held my face in her hands. No matter what happens, she whispered, you must survive. I wanted to ask where she was going. I wanted to beg her not to leave. But before I could speak, she hugged me tightly and walked away. That was the last time I ever saw her. The woman who sheltered me was risking everything. If the authorities discovered she was hiding, a Jewish child, she could be imprisoned or executed. She gave me a new identity and taught me how to behave. I learned Christian prayers. I learned which holidays to mention. I learned how to answer questions without appearing nervous. Every day felt like a test. The smallest mistake could expose me. Sometimes soldiers entered the village unexpectedly. Whenever that happened, my heart pounded. So loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. I practiced my false identity constantly. I repeated it in my mind while eating, while walking, and while trying to sleep. Who are you? What is your name? Where were you born? I had answers prepared for everything. Months passed. Then one afternoon, a soldier stopped me on the road. He looked at me carefully and asked a simple question. What is your name, boy? My mouth went dry. For a moment, I almost gave him my real name. The name my parents had given me. The name I had carried all my life. But then I remembered my father's warning. I answered with the false name. The soldier stared at me for several seconds that felt like hours. Then he nodded and walked away. Only after he disappeared around the corner did I realize I'd been holding my breath. Life in hiding was lonely. I could never fully trust anyone. Friendships were dangerous. Children asked innocent questions that could expose me. Adults watched closely. Every conversation felt like walking across thin ice. At night, I often thought about my family. Were they alive? Had they escaped? Did they know where I was? There were no answers, only silence. As the war continued, conditions worsened everywhere. Food shortages became severe. People traded valuable possessions for scraps of bread. Winter was especially cruel. Some mornings I woke up shivering because there was no fuel left for heating. Hunger became a constant companion. I learned what it felt like to dream about food. I dreamed about fresh bread. I dreamed about soup. I dreamed about sitting at a table with my family again. Then I would wake up and remember reality. One evening, air raid sirens filled the sky. Explosions echoed in the distance. The adults whispered that the war might finally be turning. Nobody knew how long it would last, but something was changing. Despite that hope, fear remained everywhere. The authorities became increasingly desperate. Searches intensified. More people were questioned. More people disappeared. One day, rumors spread that informers were operating nearby. People who had hidden Jewish families were being reported. The woman protecting me became extremely cautious. She told me to speak less and stay indoors whenever possible. For weeks, I barely left the house. The walls felt like they were closing in. I spent hours staring through a small window, watching life continue outside. Children laughed. Farmers worked in fields. Birds crossed the sky. I wondered if I would ever be free again. Then came the day everything nearly collapsed. There was a loud knock at the door. Several men entered the house. Officials. They began asking questions. My protector remained calm, but I could see fear in her eyes. One of the men turned toward me. "What are you doing here?" I repeated the story I had practiced hundreds of times. He asked another question. Then another. Then another. Each answer had to be perfect. One mistake. One hesitation. One contradiction. That was all it would take. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the men left. When the door closed behind them, both of us sat down in silence. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. We both understood how close danger had come. Months later, the sounds of war grew louder. News traveled through villages faster than before. Entire armies were moving. Front lines were shifting. People whispered that liberation might be near. At first, I did not believe it. Too much suffering had happened. Too many promises had failed. Hope felt dangerous. But then one morning, church bells rang throughout the village. People gathered in the streets. Some were laughing, some were crying. The war was ending. I expected to feel immediate happiness. Instead, I felt confusion. For years, survival had been my only goal. I had forgotten how to imagine a future. Now I faced a new question. What came next? After liberation, efforts began to locate surviving relatives. Thousands of people searched for loved ones. Lists were posted. Names were shared. Stories were exchanged. Every day I looked for familiar names. Every day I hoped. Eventually I learned the truth. My father had not survived. My mother had not survived. My sister had not survived. The realization hit harder than any fear I had experienced during the war. While hiding, I had always believed there was a chance. A chance we would be reunited. A chance we would sit together again. A chance everything could somehow return to normal. Now that chance was gone. For a long time, I struggled to understand why I had lived when so many others had not. I carried guilt alongside grief. I asked questions that had no answers. Why me? Why was I spared? Why did I survive when entire families disappeared? Years passed before I understood that survival itself carried a responsibility. The responsibility to remember. The responsibility to tell the truth. The responsibility to speak for those who no longer could. As I grew older, people often asked how I survived. Some expected a dramatic answer. Some expected courage. Some expected a clever escape. But the truth was simpler. I survived because brave people risked their lives to help me. I survived because my parents made impossible choices. I survived because a frightened child learned how to become someone else. Yet, even after the war ended, part of me never stopped being that child. The child who checked every word before speaking. The child who feared questions. The child who carried two identities inside his mind. Today, when I think back to those years, I remember many things. I remember fear. I remember hunger. I remember loneliness. But I also remember kindness. I remember strangers who chose compassion over hatred. I remember people who risked everything to save a life that was not their own. The world often remembers wars through battles, armies, and political leaders. But for children, like me, the war was something different. It was learning that your name could be dangerous. It was hiding who you were to stay alive. It was growing up far too quickly. I was only a child when I pretended not to be Jewish. But I spent the rest of my life making sure I never had to pretend again.